caught half of you using ChatGPT for the last essay. So guess what? Your final essay is now 50 pages.
I'm making this video partially as a public service announcement. People know when you're using ChatGPT.
Do not use ChatGPT to write essays. AI detection is becoming increasingly prevalent.
If you're applying to a place like Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, this is not very useful so far. It's almost anti-useful.
I know a lot of high school students are like, oh, I'm not gonna do my homework. I'm gonna have ChatGPT do it for me. Well, guess what? You will eventually come up against somebody, whether it's a professor or a high school teacher, who is like, this writing makes no sense. And so you're gonna have to know how to write an essay. Also, if you're thinking about your essay for college, you're gonna have to write that too, right? ChatGPT can't talk about your personal experience. So today we're gonna talk about how to write an essay if you don't want to use ChatGPT. Before I get started, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to turn on notifications.
I'm designed to generate responses to questions based on my understanding of natural language.
Have you guys heard of this thing called ChatGPT, which apparently some people are using to write their college essays?
ChatGPT was launched just 2 months ago by OpenAI, and the technology is already shaking up the academic world.
So to get into it, I'm going to give you a general outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about generating the outline and generating your ideas, figuring out the connective tissue, and then framing it all together in the way that you want to set up your essay. Then we'll talk about generating body text and overall structure. Then we'll talk about how to generate introductory text, how to generate conclusion text. Remember, it's okay to keep it short. And then we'll talk about editing. Big stuff. Let me tell you a little story about ChatGPT. We've all been reading articles about it, how good it is. This candidate who is applying for a job sends us these really long emails and they kind of meander around. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. You read it and you're like, I don't know what you're trying to say. I don't know why you wrote this email. I don't know what I'm supposed to do as a result of having read this. And so we're writing to this candidate, can you write out specifically what you're going to do? And he keeps sending the same kind of meandering email and it doesn't really answer the question. And at one point he defined a term that I was like, if we're hiring for this job, we have to know what this term means. It's like a zero requirement. And one of my staff members said to me, hey, Alyssa, I think it's possible that he's having ChatGPT write his emails. And of course, we've all been reading about ChatGPT, right? But then I kind of looked back and I was like, you know, some of these sentences don't really make sense and are not truly communicating information. So I think this fine fellow has been ChatGPTing us. Needless to say, we are not hiring him. And so I'm making this video partially as a public service announcement. People know when you're using ChatGPT.
All right, what the hell is going on? You tell me what's going on. Clearly, somebody told Stan about ChatGPT. You guys are using it to write essays too. Yes, we are all using it. This can't be open source, you guys. If everyone starts using ChatGPT, then we lose our unfair advantage.
So today we're going to talk about what are the hallmarks of a great essay so that when you're writing it, you kind of know how. For me, the hardest part of writing an essay was always coming up with the introduction and conclusion. You might think of this as the thesis statement, whatever you call it. The easiest thing for me was always to take a list of the things that I wanted to talk about, write them down, figure out what the connective tissue was between them. Sometimes you don't know what you want to say. You know the examples that you feel comfortable talking about. So I've always found it's easier to start from the examples and then say, okay, what point does all of this coalesce into? What single thing do all of these things tell me? I was thinking about what I could use for fodder, and I was like, all right, so I'm sort of up to here talking about the SAT and why it matters. And this is the thing I talk about all the time. So if I were going to use examples, here's the ones I would use. You have 2.3 times the chance of getting in. You self-select into a smaller pool by sending SAT scores, and if you multiply both, you can increase your chance of getting in by up to 7 times. HBCUs don't give scholarships and merit aid without SATs. Moving your SAT score with a high GPA can move your salary from like $52,000 to $128,000, which is 2.5 times, which is crazy. So I'd look at those and I'd be like, okay, what's the connective tissue between those? The SAT matters. People are saying we're test optional, but actually the SAT totally matters. And here's why. What I just did was I started with my examples. I started with the things I wanted to say, and then I said, what point are all of these things making? The next part is thinking about actually constructing it. So what I would do, when you are writing a paragraph, remember, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. It's really funny when you talk to people who were educated in other countries, their method of convincing people is not as repetitive, but that's like an old sales maxim. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. And so we do this thing where we like to hit home. A lot of American writing is about persuasion. And if you think about an essay, it's a lot about persuasion. You're saying, I believe this thing because of all of these examples. If you're getting to the point where You wrote your body paragraphs and you're like, okay, these are good. But for intro and conclusion, I have one thing, right? Why is the SAT such a big lever? That's my statement. The SAT is a huge lever. Thesis statement. Okay, how do I jazz that up? How do I actually turn that into a paragraph? What you can do, here are a couple cheap tricks. You can talk about where we are and why this is relevant or interesting. So let's take the SAT example. Where are we? More kids now are saying college is not for me than ever before. But let me quote some statistics to you. Going to college increases your lifespan by 7 years and increases your earnings by $1 million over the course of your life. So now I've given you context, right? I've talked about why college is important. And for colleges, a lot of them you have to take the SAT. And even if you don't have to take it, it's going to help you get in. So I'm giving you all of that context. So then you go, you've already written your body paragraphs. Now you got to go to your conclusion. I always found the conclusions the hardest because it was like, wow, it's a restatement of the theme. So basically I say the thesis that I've already said, just in different words. I paraphrase it. Okay, then what? The conclusion is a great place for hypotheticals. How does it influence other things? What could it suggest that a person should do? Should, could, would, right? Hypotheticals, the Wood brothers. As you're thinking about writing your conclusion, you can also talk about why it's significant. What would this pertain to? And what would this impel me to do potentially in the future? Or what could this instruct someone into doing? And then why that's all relevant. Another one, how does this now bear further investigation? Or what now bears further investigation now that you have this information? So if you're thinking about the essay as a whole, you're thinking of it kind of as a sandwich of sandwiches. If you're thinking about it from a macro perspective, I want the whole essay to be a sandwich, right? Intro and conclusion, my two breads, and the 3 paragraphs are my meats. But I also want each paragraph to be its own little sandwich, where the first sentence is an introduction, the last sentence is a conclusion, and then the inside are the things that bear it out. So for instance, if you're giving an example, you want to think of 3 kind of things to say to enrich that example to tie it back to your original thesis. The other thing to say, it's okay to keep your conclusions brief. Sometimes you don't have that much to say and you've just written an entire paper. You restate your thesis, you say why it's important, why it's relevant, what it might be able to affect, and 1 or 2 ways that we could use it in the future. And you're like, I don't have anything else to say. Great, you're done. That's okay. ChatGPT is, I think, particularly offensive because they do seem to have so much to say, which brings me to the next part, which is talking about editing. So this is a thing that a lot of students have a lot of trouble with because revision often feels like, I don't know how many times I have to revise it to get it perfect because I don't know what perfect is.
I gotta tell you, it was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
What are all the things that have to be checked off for me to say, okay, I'm done with this project? Let me give you a quick checklist. So first thing I would say, sounds nice, says nothing. There is a teacher at Park East High School, Ms. Worthington, who uses that when she's grading students' papers. I think it's hilarious. Sounds nice, says nothing. And so if you've ever met a person who uses a lot of filler words or takes a really long time to say something that could be said in a short period of time, sounds nice, says nothing. So read your paper and instead of trying to sound smart, try to be clear. I think a lot of people think that when they use big words, it makes them sound smart. It often doesn't. Often they are using big words incorrectly. That's called a malapropism. So for instance, I was a professional opera singer for 13 years. I remember meeting someone at a family reunion and she said, oh, do you sing Acapulco? And I looked at her and I was like, what? And then I realized she meant a cappella, which means without accompaniment. That's an example of a malapropism. Somebody used the word exasperate instead of exaggerate yesterday. Malapropism. When we are using words that we can't completely control, we are often doing malapropisms, and the people around us know that they're happening, and they actually make the person who's using those words look less smart rather than more smart. I would say your best bet is to be as clean and clear and insightful and specific as possible. If there's an easier way to say it that way. That wisdom comes from like Mark Twain. I don't even remember who, but only use a big word if that's the only word that will sort of quantify the thing that's going on. Very interesting, right? So you skimmed for sounds nice, says nothing, these kind of long, awkward, drawn out phrases. Another thing that my kids said to me the other day, they said, well, we have a word count, so we use these phrases to increase the word count. What if you didn't? What if you challenged yourself to just say more stuff with the word count, like have 4 examples instead of 3? Mind-blowing, right? Then spelling, grammar, and punctuation. So spelling, that should be taken care of by your word processor. Also, don't assume that just because Google Docs thinks that it's a grammar error that it is. Sometimes Google Docs is wrong. Don't assume that just because it's underlined in blue, it's wrong. but that can help you. The best test that I would use is is it a sentence test? So remember, sentence has to have a subject and a verb. He ran, dad helped, I ate, all full sentences. So it has to have a subject and a verb. It should not have a dependent clause marker word without an independent clause. So a dependent clause marker word might be like, instead of eating in the corner. Instead of eating in the corner, what? So you need more information, right? You need an independence clause. He ate in the corner. I don't need an independent clause. I have an independent clause. It's already there. So I would do the sentence test, make sure each one of your sentences can stand on its own and that there's a subject and a verb that are active and there's no extra dependent clause marker word. After that, I would say one more thing you got to do. Ask yourself, what do I want the person reading this to think? Especially if you're writing a personal essay, like when you're writing a college essay, what do you want the person who's reading this to think of you after you're done? Do you want them to think you're smart, funny, warm, charming, kind, wise? There are lots of things that someone can think after reading an essay, and many of them are good. It's not like, oh, I want them to think all good things. We got to pick some, right? So if you're talking about like a coming of age story, maybe you want them to understand that you're smarter now than you used to be. If you're talking about something bad happened to you and you made lemonade out of lemons, you want people to understand that you're flexible and resilient. Like, what are the things that you want people to understand, and how are you sending that message? So the last thing I would say, make sure someone else reads it. Obviously, if it's an essay that you're turning in to a professor for a grade, the professor isn't going to read it beforehand, although they might if you go to their office hours and ask them to. But in those cases, you can take it to a writing lab. If you're living at home, have your mom or dad read it, or have somebody that lives with you or somebody that cares about you read it. If it's an essay and it really matters for like your English class and your social studies teacher is willing to read it for you, do that. Take them up on it. Anybody else's eyes will give you a better opportunity to look at it fresh. Have your computer read it to you. That's a great way to look at it from a different perspective. When we are involved in our own writing, we're super into it and we understand the thing that we're trying to say. So sometimes you'll leave out a couple words, but your mind fills them in because your mind knows that's the thing you're trying to say. But if you listen to it, you're listening to it with a different perspective rather than reading it. And so then you'll hear missing words. Basically, the idea of having something or someone read it to you is getting a fresh perspective on what you've written. That's pretty much it. If you are doing those things, your essay is going to be significantly better than it was when you started and very likely to be extremely successful. Thanks for watching. So today, we talked a lot about how to write an essay if you're not trying to use ChatGPT. And remember that when you do use ChatGPT, probably the person that you're using it with knows. Post in the comments what's still hard, what you'd still like to know about writing an essay, and I'll see you next time.